Have you ever woken up one day and realized you wasted almost 2 decades of your life chasing something that never really existed? I'm Sophia. I'm 40 years old, and I discovered in the worst possible way that there's a brutal difference between loving someone and becoming hostage to another person's problems. What I learned in the most painful way possible is that there are men who will suck all your emotional energy, use your capacity to love as a crutch for their own weaknesses, and still convince you that you're selfish for wanting reciprocity. You know, when you grow up in a town like Cedar Creek, Tennessee, where everybody knows everybody, you learn early that your reputation is pretty much all you have. My family, the Thompsons, was always respected around here. We weren't rich, far from it, but we had something money can't buy, tradition and a last name that means something. My father worked his whole life at the same furniture factory. My mother raised 3 kids practically alone, while he worked double shifts to keep the house running. It was that classic American lower middle class life, dignified but tight. You know how it is, always counting pennies, but never letting anyone notice when things were difficult. The pressure to keep up appearances in a traditional Southern family is something that those of you who haven't lived it might not be able to completely understand. It was like carrying an invisible weight all the time, you know? My 2 brothers and I were completely different, as if we were from different planets even though we grew up in the same house. Matthew, the youngest, was always the brain of the family, that guy who spent hours studying while Noah and I were out there playing or getting into some trouble. Since he was little, he talked about being a doctor, then became a doctor in public health, and man, he made it. Today he's always traveling, giving lectures, doing research. He's like that brother you see twice a year, but everyone in town asks how he's doing. My parents' pride, right? Not that they weren't proud of me and Noah, but let's face it, having a doctor's son in a family like ours was like winning the social lottery. You guys know how that is, right? Noah, on the other hand, was the immediate action guy. If Matthew was the brain, Noah was pure practicality, that type of person who can't sit still, who needs to see results yesterday. He started working at 15, lied about his age to get a job at a mechanic shop, and since then, never stopped. He changed jobs like people change clothes, not because he was irresponsible, but because he got bored too quickly. Sophia, he would tell me, life is too short to waste time with things that don't give results. He was like that, straight to the jugular, no beating around the bush. While Matthew planned his life 10 years ahead, Noah lived each day as if it were his last. 2 completely opposite mentalities, but both effective in their own way. And me, well, I was the middle one in every sense, both in age and personality. I wasn't the academic genius or the practical action guy. I was the dreamer, the one who kept imagining what my perfect life would be like while watching romantic movies hidden in my room. You know, those girls who make mental lists of what their wedding will be like, how many kids they'll have, what type of house they'll live in. That was exactly it. I wanted financial independence, sure, but I wasn't driven by ambition like my brothers. I was driven by the desire to find my place in the world, you know? I wanted a job that paid my bills, a pretty little house, and mainly, I wanted to find my Prince Charming. Yeah, I know how that sounds nowadays, but hey, it was 2004, things were different. The pressure of being a Thompson in Cedar Creek was real. Our family had a reputation to uphold, especially in a little southern town where gossip runs faster than flowing water. My mother always said, Sophia, honey, remember that everything you do reflects on our family name, and man, that weighed heavy. I couldn't even look at someone sideways without 3 people calling my mother, telling distorted versions of the story. It was like living in a fishbowl, you know? Everyone watching, judging, forming opinions, and the worst part is that being a woman in a traditional Southern family, the expectations were even higher. I had to be respectable, proper, but not too proper, so I wouldn't become an old maid. It was an impossible balance to maintain. You guys watching this channel, especially the women, can you relate to this? But there was something liberating about knowing I had 2 completely different examples of how to live life right there in my own house. Matthew showed me it was possible to dream big and achieve things that seemed impossible for our social class. But the price was total dedication. Sacrifices, years studying, while everyone else was having fun. Noah showed me it was possible to live intensely, enjoy every moment, but always with the risk of never having real stability. And I was there in the middle, trying to figure out which path was mine, watching my brothers build their lives while I was still trying to understand what the hell I wanted from mine. It was frustrating, but at the same time comforting to know I had options. The problem is that sometimes having too many options can be more paralyzing than liberating. Have you guys noticed that? What I didn't know at the time, and this is something I only understood much later, is that I was creating completely unrealistic expectations about how my life should be. I wanted Matthew's stability, Noah's spontaneity. And on top of that, I wanted all of this to come wrapped in a perfect romantic package that I saw in movies. It was like wanting to have your cake and eat it too, you know? I thought that because I was a good person, because I came from a respectable family, because I had good intentions, the universe owed me a perfect life. What naivety, right? But that's how we think when we're young. We think we deserve things just for existing. I had no idea that real life doesn't work like a romantic movie script, and that sometimes the best intentions can lead to the worst places. At 20 years old, I was working at a little women's clothing store at the Cedar Creek Mall. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid my small bills and gave me that sense of independence I wanted so much. Every day I woke up thinking, today might be the day my real life begins. You know that feeling that you're just waiting for life to happen? That was exactly it. I saw my friends starting to date seriously, some already talking about marriage, and I was in that good and bad anxiety at the same time. Good, because I knew my time would come. Bad because, well, what if it didn't? What if I was one of those people destined to be alone? These thoughts started planting a little seed of desperation that I didn't even notice at the time, but that was going to grow much more than I imagined. What I would discover in the next few years is that when you're desperate for your life to begin, you end up making choices that ... Well, let's say they're not always the smartest. But that, my dears, is a story for us to unpack in the next few minutes. Because if you think growing up in a traditional family in a small town was already complicated, wait until you hear about what happened when I finally thought I found the one. At 20 years old, I had this completely romanticized view of how love should work. You know, that Hollywood thing where you meet someone, there's that instant chemistry, and boom, you live happily ever after. I watched The Notebook religiously and kept thinking, when will it be my turn to have a Noah in my life? It was pathetic, I know, but blame the movies, right? Every guy I met, I was already imagining what our love story would be like. How he would propose to me, what type of wedding dress I would wear. My mind created entire scripts based on a first meeting or a casual conversation. It was like I lived in a constant state of romantic expectation, waiting for my life to transform into a romantic comedy at any moment. The problem is that real life rarely cooperates with our mental scripts. Have you guys noticed that? My first serious relationship was with Jake Morrison, a guy I met at a graduation party. Typical all-American boy, played baseball in high school, had that smile that melted any small-town girl. For 3 months, I thought I had found my happy ending. He took me to the drive-in, we bought popcorn and talked until late in his car, a red Ford pickup that he loved more than any person. It was all very cute, very teenage dream, you know? But then the first red flags started appearing that I, of course, completely ignored. He only wanted to go out on weekends, never properly introduced me to his friends. And whenever I talked about future plans, he changed the subject faster than a politician during election time. 3 months later, I discovered he was keeping his options open. Basically, I was one among several. A second attempt was with Marcus Chen, a guy who worked at the bank, where I opened my first checking account. Asian American, super polite, had that good husband material vibe that my mother loved. He was everything Jake wasn't. Responsible, communicative, already talking about future plans in the second month of dating. For a moment, I thought, Okay, maybe I was looking for love in all the wrong places. Marcus was the type of guy every mother wants for her daughter: stable job, family values, respectful. But you know what the problem was? Zero chemistry. Kissing him was like kissing my cousin, technically harmless, but completely tasteless. It was like eating hospital food, nutritious, but after 4 months trying to force a passion that simply didn't exist. We broke up on good terms, basically. Code for, we're both relieved this is over. Between 21 and 24 years old, it was a parade of relationships that lasted between 2 and 6 months, each one with its own set of problems. There was Ryan, who was funny but had no ambition at all, like zero drive, zero plans. Daniel, who was too ambitious and treated me like an accessory for his young professional image. Kyle, who was sweet but had mommy issues that not even therapy could resolve in a decade. Each relationship that ended, I became more confused about what the hell I really wanted. It was like I had a mental list of qualities that my ideal man should have. But every time I found someone who checked some boxes, he was lacking in other crucial areas. I started wondering if I was too picky or if it really was that hard to find someone who was, I don't know, complete. What bothered me most was seeing my friends getting their love lives together while I seemed to be stuck on repeat. Jessica got married at 22 to her high school boyfriend. Amanda got engaged to a guy she met at work after 6 months of dating. Even my cousin Patricia, who was 2 years younger than me, was already living with her boyfriend. It was like everyone had received a manual on how to make relationships work, and I somehow lost my copy. You know that feeling that you're watching life happen around you but somehow you can't get into the game? That was exactly it. And the worst part is that in Cedar Creek, where everybody knows everybody, your romantic failures become conversation topics at the beauty salon and the grocery store. The pressure of not getting a bad reputation in a small town was something else. People in the South, especially in cities like Cedar Creek, there was still that mentality that a family girl can't give it away to Isalee or she'll lose value in the marriage market. Ridiculous, I know, but it was reality. I had to navigate between being approachable enough to attract the right guys, but not too available so I wouldn't lose respect. It was like walking on an emotional tightrope all the time. Each breakup was analyzed by the community. I wonder if she did something wrong. Maybe she's being too picky. Poor girl. Maybe she just wasn't meant for marriage. These conversations reached me through my mother, who heard everything at church and at women's club meetings. The pressure was real, and I swear to God, it started affecting my choices in ways I didn't even realize at the time. At 24 years old, I started developing a kind of relationship anxiety that I didn't even know how to name. Every first date, I was already overthinking everything. Will he call me back? Did I talk too much? Was I interesting enough? Maybe I should have worn something different. It was exhausting, guys. And the worst part is that this anxiety started to show, which obviously made me less attractive to potential partners. It's like a vicious cycle. The more you want something, the more desperate you become, and the less likely you are to get it. I was starting to realize that maybe my approach to love was all wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. It was like being lost in an emotional maze, trying every path but always ending up in the same place, alone and confused. What I didn't know is that all this frustration and desperation was preparing me to make the worst decision of my romantic life. Because when you're tired of kissing frogs and desperate to find your prince, you sometimes confuse smooth talk with a real man. And that's exactly what happened when I met someone who seemed to be everything I was looking for, but turned out to be my biggest mistake. But we'll get to that part of the story in just a moment, because what happened next changed everything, and not in a good way. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in March that my life took a turn that I thought would be for the better, but which was actually the beginning of my biggest lesson about relationships. I was working at the store when this guy walked in who simply commanded everyone's attention. He wasn't necessarily the most handsome I'd ever seen, but he had a presence, you know? Brandon Mitchell. Well-cut brown hair, always in an impeccable dress shirt, that confident smile that screamed, I know exactly what I want from life. He sold life insurance and was looking for clothes for an important presentation. The way he talked, gestured, how every word seemed calculated to make an impact. Man, I was mesmerized immediately. It was like a real man had finally appeared in my life, not more of those insecure boys I had dated before. And the best part of all, he seemed genuinely interested in me. Brandon had this supernatural ability to make you feel like the most important person in the world when he was talking to you. You know those salespeople who can convince you to buy anything? That was exactly it, but applied to personal charm. He remembered every detail of our conversations, always asked about my family, my work, my dreams. Sophia, you deserve much more than working in this store your whole life, he said, looking me in the eyes in a way that made me feel seen, understood. In the first months, he took me to restaurants I didn't even know existed in Cedar Creek, gave me small but thoughtful gifts, always said the right words at the right time. It was like he had studied a manual on how to win a woman and was applying each technique with military precision. And man, it worked like clockwork. The first 6 months with Brandon were like living in a fairy tale. He introduced me to his family at a formal Sunday dinner, took me to his company events where I felt like a real lady, always arm in arm with a man that other women clearly envied. My mother was over the moon. Finally, I had found a real man who could give me a good life. Even my brothers approved, which was rare. Matthew said Brandon seemed to have good head on his shoulders, and Noah commented that at least this one had ambition and wasn't another loser. I felt like I had finally entered the club of accomplished women. You know when you feel like your real life has finally begun? That was exactly that feeling. Every morning I woke up thinking, this is the life I always wanted. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to change. First, it was little things that I attributed to stress from his work. Brandon started canceling some dates at the last minute. Baby, a last-minute presentation came up. You understand, right? Then he stopped including me in some social events. It's kind of boring, just work people talking shop. When I suggested meeting more of his friends, there was always an excuse. We're going to do that soon, just not this weekend. But what bothered me most was when I tried to talk about our future together. Mentioned marriage. We have plenty of time to think about that. Talked about living together. Let's see how things go. It was like he had an invisible wall that he put up every time the conversation got too serious. But I rationalized everything. He just needs more time. Men are like that. What I didn't understand at the time, and this is something I only comprehended years later, is that Brandon was a master of emotional manipulation. He knew exactly how to keep me interested without ever really committing. It was like fishing. He threw the bait, I bit, he pulled a little, then loosened the line. Always giving me just enough attention so I wouldn't give up, but never enough for me to feel secure. When I started questioning where our relationship was going, he would show up with flowers, a romantic dinner, and those magic words, Sophia, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Just give me a little more time to get my life in order. And there I went, hook, line, and sinker, believing that this time would be different. It's impressive how we can convince ourselves that temporary changes represent permanent changes when we really want to believe it. The years went by and I found myself in a situation that was comfortable, but not fulfilling. Brandon and I had our routine. He took me to dinner on weekends. We spent time together. He gave me just enough affection for me to feel loved, but never talked about marriage, moving in together, or building a real future. It was like being in a relationship that was frozen in time. My friends started making comments. How long have you guys been together again? Has he said anything about marriage? Girl, what are you guys waiting for? And I was always defending him. We're fine like this, no need to rush. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it because it would mean I had wasted years of my life in a relationship that wasn't going anywhere. And in Cedar Creek, where everybody knew everything about everyone, admitting failure wasn't something I was ready to face. There came a point where I started feeling like I was living someone else's life. I was in my early 30s, watching all my friends getting married, having kids, building families, while I was stuck in a relationship that seemed good on paper but felt empty inside. Brandon still treated me well in public, still said all the right things, but there was this emotional distance that I couldn't bridge. It was like he had decided that our relationship had reached its maximum potential and that was it. No growth, no progression, just ... maintenance mode. And the scary part is that I started to accept that maybe this was good enough. Maybe I didn't deserve more than this. Maybe I was being too demanding, expecting marriage and family. This acceptance was probably the most dangerous part of this whole situation, because when you start settling, you stop fighting for what you really want. What I still didn't know is that this comfortable misery I was experiencing was just setting me up for the next chapter of my life, one that would involve decisions I never thought I would be capable of making. Because when you get frustrated enough, when you feel like your life is slipping away while you wait for someone else to make moves, well, sometimes you start making choices that surprise even yourself. And those choices, they were about to take me places I never imagined I would go. The first 3 years with Brandon were an emotional roller coaster disguised as a stable relationship. I lived in that constant hope that he just needs more time. You know, when you're always waiting for the other person to mature, to finally understand that you were made for each other. That was exactly it. Every dating anniversary that passed without a marriage proposal, I rationalized. Next year, he'll be more financially stable. After he gets that promotion, when his family situation improves, I had an excuse for every deadline I created in my head that he invariably ignored. It was like I had become the CEO of excuses for Brandon Inc., working overtime to defend an employee who clearly didn't want the promotion. And the worst part is that I did this with so much conviction that I even believed my own lies. From the 4th to 7th year, things got even more complex because Brandon had developed this ability to give me crumbs of hope at just the right moment. Like when I was almost at the limit of my patience, when I was already considering ending things. He would show up with some romantic gesture or a conversation about our future. Once he took me to see houses just to get an idea of what it would be like. Another time, he casually mentioned that he had seen a beautiful ring in a shop window. They were small actions that reignited my hope and made me think, see, he's thinking about it, he's just taking his time. But weeks would pass, and nothing concrete happened. It was like he knew exactly how much rope to give me before I considered jumping ship. Looking back now, I realize he was a master at emotional manipulation. But at the time, I only saw a complex man who needed patience to show his true feelings. Years 8 through 12 were when I started entering a phase one can only describe as resigned acceptance. I had invested so much time, so much emotional energy, so much of my identity in this relationship that the thought of starting over seemed absolutely terrifying. All my friends were already married, some already having second kids, and I was still in the same situation. In Cedar Creek, at 30 years old, you're basically considered a spinster if you still haven't made it happen. The church ladies started making comments like poor Sophia. Still waiting for Brandon to do something, or maybe she should give him an ultimatum. Hearing these things secondhand through my mother was devastating, but also reinforced my determination to make things work with Brandon. It was like my stubbornness had become bigger than my common sense. The worst part of these middle years was how I had started to lose myself in the process of waiting. I stopped pursuing things that interested me because I was always available in case Brandon wanted to make plans. Stopped applying for better jobs because maybe we'll move when he gets that transfer. I basically put my entire life on hold, waiting for another person to decide if I was worth committing to. And you know what's really messed up? I thought this was romantic. I thought this kind of devotion and sacrifice was what love looked like. No one ever told me that healthy love doesn't require you to disappear into another person. Actually, my Southern upbringing had taught me that good women support their men even when it costs them everything. So I kept supporting, kept waiting, kept believing that eventually my loyalty would be rewarded. By year 10, I had developed what I can only call relationship Stockholm syndrome. I defended Brandon harder than he defended himself. When people questioned our lack of progression, I would get almost angry. You don't understand our relationship. We have something special that doesn't need paper to prove. But deep down, I knew I was lying. Deep down, I was dying inside. Every time I went to another friend's wedding alone, because Brandon had some work excuse. Every time someone asked, "When's your turn?" and I had to smile and say, "When it's meant to be." I was slowly suffocating my own dreams and aspirations to maintain this illusion that what we had was enough. And the scary part is that I was getting good at being satisfied with crumbs instead of demanding the full meal I deserved. Years 11 and 12 were when reality really started to hit me. I was approaching my mid-30s, and suddenly all those comments about biological clocks and limited time didn't seem like abstract concepts anymore. I would look in the mirror and see lines around my eyes that weren't there when I met Brandon. I would see friends posting pictures of family vacations, first steps, birthday parties for kids who were already walking and talking, while I was still waiting for my life to begin. There were days when I would have panic attacks, thinking about wasting what were supposed to be my prime years in a relationship that was going absolutely nowhere. But even then, even with all that fear and resentment, I couldn't bring myself to walk away, because doing so would mean admitting that I had been wrong for over a decade. The turning point came during year 12, when I finally had what I can only describe as a moment of brutal clarity. I was at my cousin's baby shower, surrounded by women who had built real lives with their partners. Listening to them talk about mortgage payments and school districts and vacation plans, and I realized that I had absolutely nothing to contribute to the conversation. Nothing. After 12 years with Brandon, we had no shared assets, no shared goals, no shared anything except routine and familiarity. I was living like a permanent girlfriend in a relationship that had no intention of evolving. Sitting there, watching my cousin open baby gifts and talk about nursery themes, I felt like I was watching life through glass, present but completely disconnected from any real happiness or fulfillment. And that's when I knew that something had to give. But even knowing that change was necessary didn't make it easy to execute, because when you spend 12 years building your identity around a person and a relationship, walking away feels like committing emotional suicide. I didn't know who Sophia was without Brandon. I didn't know what I wanted if it wasn't what I had been wanting for over a decade. And more terrifying than anything, I didn't know if I would ever find anything better than what I was leaving behind. Sometimes the devil you know feels safer than the angel you don't. But life, as you'll see, has a way of forcing your hand when you can't make decisions for yourself. Breaking up with Brandon was like ripping off a Band-Aid that had been stuck to the skin for 12 years. Painful, bloody, and leaving a mark that I didn't know would heal properly. I remember the exact day, September 15th, on a rainy Thursday. I had rehearsed the speech about 50 times in the mirror, but when the time came, all that came out was, "Brandon, I can't do this anymore, we're done." He didn't even seem surprised, you know. He just nodded his head, said, "I understand," and left. 12 years summarized in less than 5 minutes. No fight, no drama, no him begging me to stay. And somehow, this lack of fight for our relationship hurt more than any screaming could have hurt. It was like he had been waiting for this moment as much as I had, but without the courage to take the initiative. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and cried. Not just for the end of the relationship, but for all the years I had wasted waiting for something that was never going to happen. The first months of being single were an emotional roller coaster that I wasn't prepared to face. During the day, I felt empowered, free, like I had finally taken control of my life. But when night came, the silence of the apartment was deafening. I no longer knew how to be alone after 12 years always considering another person in my plans. Suddenly, I had to relearn how to make decisions just for myself. What did I want for dinner? What movie did I want to watch? What clothes did I want to wear? It seems silly, but when you spend so much time being half of a couple, you forget how to be a whole person alone. There were nights when I would call Brandon just to hear his voice, but I always hung up before he could answer. It was pathetic, but it was real. The physical loneliness was what caught me most off guard. 12 years used to hugs, caresses, intimacy, and suddenly, nothing. My body literally missed another person's touch. I started taking longer baths just to feel the hot water on my skin, buying expensive creams just to have an excuse to touch myself. I know this sounds weird, but when you get used to constant physical affection and suddenly don't have it anymore, it's like your body goes into withdrawal mode. I caught myself looking at couples on the street with an envy that bordered on desperation. I saw a guy running his hand through his girlfriend's hair at the coffee shop and my heart would tighten. It was like I had developed a hunger that I didn't know how to satisfy in a healthy way. And that's when I started making decisions that, looking back, weren't the smartest of my life. The first slip happened 3 months after the breakup. I was at a bar with the girls trying to get back in the game when I met David, a guy who was passing through Cedar Creek on business. Handsome, funny, and mainly interested. We talked all night, drank more than we should have, and when he suggested going to his hotel, I went. It wasn't about passion or emotional connection, it was pure physical need, mixed with wounded ego. I needed to feel desired again, needed to remember that I was still attractive to other men. The next morning, when he left for the next city, I felt a strange mix of empowered and empty. Empowered because I had done something just for me. Empty because I realized that sex without emotional connection left a different, deeper hunger. But I also realized that I had a power that I had forgotten I possessed. The following months were a period that I now call my experimental phase. It wasn't promiscuity in the traditional sense. I wasn't going out with just anyone who showed up. But whenever loneliness became unbearable, whenever I felt invisible or forgotten, I would find someone to remind me that I still existed as a desirable woman. There was Michael, recently divorced, who perfectly understood my need for companionship without commitment. James, 10 years younger, who made me feel like I was still young and irresistible. Robert, a businessman from Nashville, who passed through Cedar Creek once a month and always called me when he was in town. I didn't lie to any of them about what I wanted, temporary companionship, nothing more. And surprisingly, most understood and accepted the terms, but what started as a way to deal with loneliness began to transform into something more complex. I realized I was using these encounters as a way to avoid dealing with my own feelings about the breakup with Brandon and about my uncertain future. It was easier to lose myself in the attention of other men than to face the fact that I, at 32 years old, had no idea who I was when I wasn't defined by a relationship. Each encounter was like a small dose of validation that kept me functioning but never really satisfied me. It was like eating fast food when you're hungry for a home-cooked meal. It kills the hunger in the moment, but never really nourishes. And slowly, very slowly, I started to realize that I was creating a pattern that could be as destructive as my relationship with Brandon had been. The wake-up call came when I found myself scheduling dates with 3 different men in the same week. Not because I was enjoying life or feeling empowered, but because I was afraid of being alone with my own thoughts for more than 2 consecutive nights. That night, looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror after another encounter that left my body satisfied but my soul empty, I had a scary realization. I was using men the same way Brandon had used me, as an emotional band-aid, a way to avoid real intimacy with myself. I had left one emotional prison to enter another, only this time I was both the prisoner and the guard. And it was in this moment of brutal clarity that I decided I needed to stop, that I needed to figure out how to be happy alone before trying to be happy with anyone else. But the universe, as you'll discover, had other plans for me. Because sometimes, right when you decide you need to focus on yourself, someone appears who tests all your resolution. And this person who appeared in my life wasn't anything I expected. In fact, he was exactly the type of person my more sensible version would have completely avoided. But when you're vulnerable, when you're trying to rebuild your identity, sometimes you make decisions that make sense in the heart, but don't make sense at all in the head. And this next decision was going to take me to a place even more complicated than I had already been. Tyler appeared in my life when I least expected it, and definitely when I shouldn't have let him in. It was a Friday night at Murphy's Pub, that somewhat rustic little bar on the outskirts of Cedar Creek. And I was there with the girls trying to forget another week of monotonous work at the store. He was playing pool with his friends. And the first thing that caught my attention wasn't his appearance, although he was handsome in that young and carefree way, but the way he laughed. You know, that genuine, loud laugh that comes from someone who hasn't been broken by life yet. That was exactly it. When our eyes met for the first time, he gave me a smile that was pure light, without hidden agendas, without mind games. After years dealing with Brandon's emotional complexity and the superficial post-breakup encounters, that simplicity was like a glass of ice water on a scorching hot day. It was dangerously refreshing. The age difference hit like a punch to the stomach when he approached to strike up a conversation. Tyler was 22 years old, 10 years younger than me, 10 years when I was graduating from high school. He was learning to tie his shoes. When I met Brandon, he was still playing video games in elementary school. My first reaction was to politely decline any kind of romantic interest, but Tyler had a charming persistence that wasn't invasive, you know? He wasn't trying to impress me with money or status, like men my age did. He just wanted to talk, laugh, get to know more about me. Age is just a number, Sophia, he said with that innocent confidence that only young people have. What matters is how two people connect. And man, as cliché as that sounded, there was something in his simplicity that resonated with me in a way I couldn't ignore. The first few weeks were a constant internal conflict. I knew that accepting to go out with Tyler was a bad idea for at least 15 different reasons. Cedar Creek was already full of gossip about my breakup with Brandon, and now I was going to give more ammunition to the gossip mills by dating a boy who could be my younger brother. My family was going to freak out. The church was going to have material for months of whispered conversations. And more importantly, what the hell did I, a 32-year-old woman trying to rebuild her life, have in common with a 22-year-old who still lived with his parents? But then Tyler would show up at the store where I worked just to see me for 5 minutes. Or send funny messages that made me laugh in the middle of terrible days, and all my logic went out the window. He had a way of making me feel young again, as if I could go back in time and have a second chance to make different choices. What definitely won me over was how Tyler treated me. There were no games, manipulation, or emotional unavailability. When he said he was going to call me, he called. When he made a date, he showed up. When he said he was thinking about me, I believed it because I could see in his eyes that it was true. After 12 years being treated like an option by Brandon, being treated like a priority by Tyler was intoxicating. He looked at me like I was the most fascinating thing in the world, asked about my dreams, my fears, my experiences in a genuine way that I had forgotten existed. "You're incredible, Sophia," he said. And somehow I believed it because he had no hidden agenda behind the words. It was like rediscovering what kind of man I deserved, even if that man came in a completely unexpected package. The decision for us to live together came after 6 months of dating that were honestly the lightest and happiest I'd had in years. Tyler had lost his job at the mechanic shop where he worked, and was struggling to pay rent for the tiny apartment he shared with a roommate. My logical brain screamed red flag, but my heart saw a young man who needed help, and who, at the same time, was giving me the kind of unconditional love I had always wanted. "We love each other, right?" he said when he suggested we live together. "So why not take this step?" It was logic too simple for a situation too complex. But I was so tired of overthinking everything that I decided to follow my heart instead of my head. Besides, after wasting 12 years waiting for commitment from Brandon, Tyler's willingness to commit was refreshing, even if the circumstances weren't ideal. My family's reaction was exactly the disaster I expected. My mother cried literal tears when I told her Tyler was going to move into my apartment. "Sophia, honey, what are people going to think? You're a Thompson. We don't live together unmarried, especially not with a boy who's young enough to be your son." My father was silent, which was somehow worse than if he had yelled. Matthew called me from whatever city he was doing research in that month to give me a lecture about making responsible choices at your age. And Noah was direct, as always. "Sis, are you having a midlife crisis or what? This kid can't even buy beer yet." The church ladies started those whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I appeared. It was like I had committed some unforgivable social sin instead of just following my heart. But you know what? For a few months, I didn't care about the judgment. For the first time in years, I woke up happy. Tyler made breakfast for both of us every morning, left little notes in my purse before I went to work, planned surprise date nights that cost nothing but were worth everything. He brought laughter back to my life, spontaneity, passion. We danced in the kitchen while making dinner, watched bad movies, and laughed until we cried. Made love like the world was going to end tomorrow. It was intense, it was real, it was everything my relationship with Brandon had never been. Tyler might have been younger, but he loved me in a way that was mature in all the ways that mattered. I finally felt like I was living instead of just existing. And for a brief moment, I believed that maybe age really was just a number. But fairy tales don't last forever, especially when you're trying to build one on a foundation that has cracks you can't see yet. Because what I discovered about Tyler in the months that followed was going to test not just our relationship, but my own sanity. Sometimes, when something seems too good to be true, it's because there are secrets hiding underneath the surface. And the secrets Tyler was hiding were darker than anything I could have imagined when I first saw that innocent smile of his across that crowded bar. The first signs that something was wrong started so subtly that I attributed everything to Tyler's stress from being unemployed. He started getting restless at night, pacing around the house like a caged animal, always with an excuse to go out. I'm going for a walk to clear my head. I need to meet some guys to see about work opportunity. At first, I thought it was sweet that he didn't want to bother me with his frustrations, that he was being considerate by giving me space to relax after work. But the outings became more frequent and longer. He would leave at 10 at night and come back at 3, 4 in the morning, always with elaborate stories about where he had been. I ran into Jake at the bar, and we ended up talking until late, or the guys were organizing a poker game, and I didn't want to be rude. The explanations made sense individually, but together they started forming a pattern that left me with a strange feeling in my stomach. What really caught my attention were the physical changes. Tyler had always been an energetic guy, but suddenly he oscillated between periods of insane hyperactivity and crashes where he slept for 12, 14 hours straight. His eyes, which had always been one of his most beautiful features, started looking different, sometimes too dilated, sometimes so small they looked like He lost weight quickly, and when I commented about him not eating properly, he always had an excuse. I'm just nervous about finding work. My stomach's been a bit upset lately. But what worried me most were the mood swings. One minute he was happy and affectionate. The next he was irritated by little things that never bothered him before. It was like I had two different people living in the same body, and I never knew which version of Tyler was going to walk through the door. The first real red flag came when I found a small plastic bag in the pocket of his jeans while doing laundry. There was a white residue inside that I didn't recognize, but my gut immediately told me it wasn't anything innocent. When I confronted Tyler about it, he had an explanation ready. "Oh, that's just some powder Jake gave me for my headache. It's herbal. Natural stuff." He said this with such conviction that I almost believed him, especially because I wanted to believe him. But that night, when he thought I was sleeping, I heard him on the phone in the bathroom. "Man, I need more, ... No, I can't wait until weekend, ... Just a small amount to get me through." My heart started racing because suddenly everything began to make sense in a way I didn't want it to make sense. The visits to his brother at the farm started soon after. Tyler's younger brother supposedly needed help with farm work, always at weird hours, middle-of-the-night emergencies that required Tyler's immediate attention. "Sophia, baby, I'm sorry, but Tommy needs help moving some equipment before morning. It has to be now because the buyers are coming tomorrow." He always had detailed explanations that sounded plausible if you didn't think too hard about them. But farms don't typically operate at 2 a.m., and equipment emergencies don't happen 3 times per week. I began to dread Tyler's phone ringing late at night, because I knew it meant another mysterious emergency that would take him away until dawn. The day that changed everything was on a Thursday afternoon when I was homesick with the flu. Tyler had gone out supposedly to look for work, and I was on the couch watching TV when someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, there were two men I didn't recognize. Both looked rough, like they hadn't slept or showered in days. "Tyler here?" one of them asked, looking past me into the apartment. "No, he's not," I replied, already feeling uneasy. "Well, when he gets back, tell him Rico's looking for him, and that he knows what this is about." The second man leaned closer. "And tell him that patience has limits, sweetheart. We don't like to wait." They left without further explanation, but the implication was crystal clear. Tyler owed them money, and by the look of these guys, it wasn't book club dues. When Tyler came home that evening, I was waiting with a storm of emotions: fear, anger, disappointment, but mostly an overwhelming sadness that my worst suspicions were being confirmed. "Tyler, we need to talk, now." I told him about the visitors, and I watched his face go through several emotions before settling on resignation. He finally admitted what I already knew but had been refusing to accept. He had been using cocaine initially just socially, but it had escalated to regular use. "Sophia, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to know because I knew it would hurt you, but I can stop, I promise. Those guys are just ... They're nobody. I'll handle it." Hearing him finally tell the truth was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief because I wasn't crazy, heartbreak because the man I loved, who I had hoped would be my fresh start, had been lying to me since probably the beginning. That night, after Tyler finally fell asleep, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I had no tears left. How had I gotten here again? How had I escaped one problematic relationship only to dive headfirst into another one that was potentially even more dangerous? I thought about my family's warnings, about all the people who had told me that dating someone so much younger was a mistake. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was destined to make bad choices when it came to men. Or maybe I was just broken in some fundamental way that attracted broken people. But one thing was clear: I was facing another crossroad, another decision about whether to fight for a relationship that might not be worth saving. And this time, the stakes felt higher because it wasn't just about wasted time, it was about my safety, my sanity, and potentially my life. The worst part was that despite everything, the lies, the drugs, the dangerous strangers at my door, I still loved Tyler. I loved the person he was, when he wasn't using, when he was just my sweet, young boyfriend who made me laugh and feel alive again. But I was beginning to understand that loving someone with addiction is like loving a ghost. You're in love with who they used to be, who they could be, but not who they actually are right now. And that realization was going to test every ounce of strength I thought I had. Because walking away from someone you love, even when you know you should, is one of the hardest things a person can do. After discovering Tyler's addiction, I entered a phase that I can only describe as savior syndrome. You know, when you believe your love will be strong enough to heal a person? That was exactly what was going through my head. I had read somewhere that people with addiction need a support system, someone who believes in them when they can't believe in themselves. And who better than the girlfriend who loves unconditionally, right? Tyler cried when he confessed everything to me, promised he would stop, said I was the most important thing in his life, and that he didn't want to lose me. "Sophia, you're my anchor," he said, looking me in the eyes with so much sincerity that my heart melted. "With you by my side, I can beat this." And man, I wanted so badly to believe it was possible that I convinced myself that my love would be enough to overcome any addiction. The first weeks after the confession were like a recovery honeymoon. Tyler was super attentive, affectionate, present in a way he hadn't been for months. He woke up early with me, made breakfast, walked me to work, picked me up at the end of the day. It was like he had gone back to being the Tyler I met at the bar, sweet, funny, completely focused on me. We talked about the future, about him getting a steady job, about maybe getting married when things stabilize. He even suggested we seek professional help together, like a couple committed to recovery. Guys, I want you to comment down below if you've been through this phase of thinking your love would save someone. For a few weeks, I really believed we had overcome the worst and that our story was going to have a happy ending. But addiction isn't something that disappears because you really want it to disappear. The first relapse happened 3 weeks after the promise to stop. Tyler disappeared for an entire night, came home the next morning with that familiar look in his eyes, guilty, ashamed, but also clearly altered. "Sophia, I'm so sorry. It was just this once, I swear. I ran into some old friends and they offered me some, and I was feeling so good that I thought I could just use a little without a problem." The excuse was always a variation of the same theme. He was happy, so he celebrated, or he was sad, so he medicated himself, or he was stressed, so he needed to relax. There was always an emotional justification that made it seem like using was a logical response to some feeling. And I, wanting so badly to believe it was an isolated slip, accepted the excuses and we restarted the recovery process. The cycle became predictably sick. Tyler would stay clean for a few days or weeks. We'd be hopeful and happy. He'd use again. I'd be devastated. He'd ask for forgiveness with real tears in his eyes. I'd forgive him and everything would start over. Each relapse I thought, okay, this time he saw he really has a problem. Now he'll take it seriously. But each promise of change lasted less time than the previous one. I started becoming a detective in my own house, checking his clothes pockets, sniffing to see if he smelled different when he came home, watching his eyes to see if they were normal. It was exhausting to live like this, but I had convinced myself it was my responsibility to be vigilant, that this was how people who love someone with addiction should act. The most twisted part of all this was how I started feeling important because of the drama. You know, when you become the heroine of your own tragedy, that was it. I was fighting for our love. Being the strong woman who doesn't abandon the man she loves in the worst phase of his life. My mother called worried. My brothers sent messages asking if I was okay, and I responded with that dignity of someone making a noble sacrifice. It's difficult, but those who truly love don't give up at the first difficulty. I had transformed my codependency into a virtue, my inability to set boundaries into proof of unconditional love. It was like I had finally found my purpose in life, saving Tyler from himself. The problem is that you can't save anyone who doesn't want to be saved, but no one had taught me that yet. Financially, things started becoming unsustainable. Tyler couldn't keep any job for more than a few weeks. There was always an excuse. The boss was an idiot. Coworkers were jealous. The work was too stressful and triggered the urge to use, so I became the sole source of income for the house. I paid rent, groceries, bills, and money still disappeared mysteriously. When I questioned strange expenses, Tyler always had an explanation. He had to help a friend. There was a medical emergency. The car broke down. I knew the money was going to drugs, but confronting this reality would mean admitting I was literally financing his addiction. It was easier to convince myself he just needed more time, more support, more love. I was working double to support our life while Tyler was destroying himself, but somehow I had managed to convince myself this was romantic. My family was desperate, watching what was happening to me. My mother lost about 5 pounds from pure worry. Spent sleepless nights imagining terrible scenarios, Tyler hitting me, drug dealers invading my house, me starting to use drugs myself. My father, who had always been a man of few words, started making comments about men who were worth something whenever Tyler was mentioned. Noah was more direct. "Sophia, this guy is going to drag you into the hole with him. You need to get out of this before it's too late." But I interpreted all their concern as lack of understanding about true love. I thought they didn't understand that real relationships involve fighting for who you love, that love isn't just accepting someone when everything's perfect. It was ironic how I used family values of loyalty and commitment to justify staying in a situation that was slowly destroying me. What I didn't understand at the time was that there's a huge difference between supporting someone who's fighting against their demons and becoming hostage to another person's demons. Tyler wasn't fighting against addiction. He was managing addiction in a way that kept me around to continue supporting him. The promises of change, the tears of regret, the periods of perfect behavior. All of this was part of a manipulative cycle that kept our relationship functioning at the minimum level necessary for me not to leave. But I would only understand this much later, when the price of trying to save Tyler almost cost me everything I had built in my life. Because sometimes, when you're determined to be the heroine of the story, you don't realize that you've actually become the victim. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 years after starting this roller coaster with Tyler, that my life took a turn I wasn't prepared to face. I was late by 2 weeks, but between the stress of dealing with Tyler's constant relapses and the exhaustion of working extra to keep our house functioning, I hadn't paid much attention. But that morning, when I got up to go to work and a wave of nausea hit me so hard I could barely make it to the bathroom, reality hit me like a punch to the stomach. I bought 3 different pharmacy tests, secretly hoping at least one of them would be negative, that it was just a mistake, hormonal stress. Anything but what I already knew deep in my heart. But all 3 showed those 2 clear lines that changed everything. I was pregnant at 37 years old, in an unstable relationship, with a man addicted to drugs. The first person I told was Tyler, and his reaction was exactly the mix of panic and denial I expected. "Are you sure? These tests sometimes give false results, right? Maybe you should take another one, or go to the doctor to confirm." He ran his hand through his hair about 50 times in 2 minutes, pacing around the room like a caged lion. But after the initial shock, something surprising happened. Tyler had a reaction I didn't expect. He knelt in front of me, put his hands on my belly that wasn't even showing anything, and said, "Sophia, this could be exactly what I needed to stop for good. Now I have a real reason to stay clean. Our baby." He cried for real, tears that seemed to come from a deep and sincere place. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe a baby really could be the miracle our relationship needed. The first weeks after the discovery were like living in a bubble of fragile hope. Tyler stopped using completely, at least. I didn't see any signs that he had been using. He started looking for work more seriously, talked about being a good father, about giving our child everything he didn't have in childhood. We spent hours talking about names, about what our baby would be like, about what kind of parents we wanted to be. He even suggested we get married before the baby was born, to do things right this time. I felt like we had finally found our purpose as a couple, like all the pain and struggle of previous years had just been a test to get to this moment. My family, even still worried about Tyler, was genuinely happy with the news that there was going to be a Thompson baby in the family. But the euphoria didn't last long. In the 2nd month of pregnancy, Tyler returned to old habits. First came the nighttime outs. "I'm just going to meet some guys to talk about a work opportunity," always with the promise to come back early. Then came the familiar physical signs, the strange eyes, the mood swings, the restlessness. When I confronted him, there was always a justification. "I'm nervous about the responsibility of being a father. I need something to deal with the stress. It was just once to celebrate getting that job interview." The difference was that now I wasn't just worried about myself. I had a child growing inside me who was going to be affected by every decision Tyler made. The idea of raising a child in that environment of instability and unpredictability gave me literal nightmares. What scared me most was imagining what Tyler would be like as a father if he couldn't even take care of himself. I imagined terrible scenarios: Tyler using drugs while taking care of the baby, drug dealers showing up at our house when I had a newborn, our child growing up watching his father on a constant roller coaster of sobriety and relapse. How was I going to explain to a child why Daddy disappeared for days, why he was sometimes happy and sometimes irritated for no apparent reason, why strange people sometimes came to collect money at our door? I started having anxiety attacks thinking about all the ways Tyler's addiction could traumatize our child before he was even born. In the 3rd month, my body started showing signs that something wasn't right. I started having light bleeding cramps that came and went, and exhaustion that was different from normal pregnancy fatigue. Tyler was in one of his recovery phases at that moment, so he took me to the doctor and stayed with me during all the exams. Dr. Johnson, who had been my family's doctor for years, ordered several tests and told me to rest. Sophia, your body is going through a lot of stress. We need to monitor closely to make sure everything goes well. I knew he wasn't just talking about physical stress in a small town like Cedar Creek. Everyone knew about my situation with Tyler. And Dr. Johnson was probably worried about emotional stress too. One Thursday morning, at the beginning of the 4th month, I woke up with a pain I had never felt before in my life. It was like someone had stuck a knife in my belly and was twisting it slowly. Tyler was sleeping heavily beside me. He had probably used the night before, so I managed to get to the bathroom alone. It was there that I saw the blood, a lot of blood, and I immediately knew I was losing the baby. I don't know how long I stayed sitting on that bathroom floor, crying silently so as not to wake Tyler, processing that everything was over before it had really begun. When I finally managed to wake him up and we got to the hospital, the doctor confirmed what I already knew. There had been a miscarriage. Our baby was gone, taking with him the last hope I had that Tyler and I could build something beautiful together. After the loss, I spent weeks trying to understand if it had been a blessing or a tragedy. On one hand, my heart was broken because I already loved that baby, had already started imagining what our family would be like. On the other hand, part of me felt relieved not to have to raise a child in that toxic and unstable environment. The guilt of feeling relief was almost worse than the pain of loss. Tyler was devastated in a way I had never seen. He cried for days, said it was his fault, that if he had really stayed clean, maybe none of this would have happened. But even in his pain, even in the sincerity of his regret, I realized that losing the baby wasn't going to fundamentally change who Tyler was. He was still addicted, still irresponsible, still someone I couldn't count on when I really needed him. And it was in this moment of brutal clarity, in the middle of my deepest pain, that I finally understood I needed to make a definitive decision about our future. After losing the baby, I entered a phase that I can only describe as painful clarity. It was like all the illusions I had built around my relationship with Tyler had disappeared at once, leaving only the raw and uncomfortable reality of who we really were together. At that moment, sitting in the hospital bed, still processing the loss, I looked at Tyler crying beside me and finally saw him for what he really was. A 25-year-old man who still acted like a troubled teenager, who couldn't take responsibility for his own life, much less for another person's life. He had spent 7 years making me promises he couldn't keep, and now we had lost our child in an environment of stress and instability that he had created. I knew I could no longer pretend that things would magically improve just because I really wanted them to. 2 weeks after the miscarriage, when I finally managed to gather enough courage to have a serious conversation, I called Tyler to sit with me in the living room and said the words I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. Tyler, I love you, but I can't live like this anymore. You have 1 month to prove you really want to change. 1 month to stay completely clean, get a job and keep it, and show you can be the man I need you to be. If at the end of this month I don't see real and lasting changes, I'm leaving for good. I said this, looking directly into his eyes, with a firmness in my voice that I didn't know I had. Tyler was silent for a few minutes, processing that this time I was serious, that it wasn't another argument that would end with him convincing me to give him another chance. Tyler's response was everything I wanted to hear. Sophia, you're right. I need a deadline, a real consequence for my actions. This month will be different, I promise. I'm going to seek professional help. I'm going to get a job. I'm going to prove I can be the man you deserve. He cried when he said this. But they were different tears from other times. They seemed more determined, less desperate. He even suggested that together we get rid of everything that could be a temptation in the house, including some contacts on his phone that I knew were connected to drugs. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel hope again, but this time it was cautious hope, tempered by the experience of having been disappointed so many times before. The first 2 weeks of the ultimatum were surprisingly promising. Tyler woke up early every day to look for work, came home with detailed stories about interviews and opportunities, stayed home every night watching movies with me or helping with household chores. He got a part-time job at an auto parts store and seemed genuinely excited about the chance to contribute financially to our house again. We started talking about the future in a way we hadn't for months, and I started feeling like maybe, finally, we had found the turning point I had been waiting for so long. But as always happened with Tyler, the change didn't last. In the third week, I started noticing familiar signs. He was staying out of the house longer than work hours justified, started making excuses to go out at night again, and that characteristic restlessness returned. When I questioned him, he always had plausible explanations. I had to work overtime. I stopped to talk to a client who might refer me to another job. I ran into a coworker, and we went for a beer. Individually, the excuses made sense, but together, they formed a pattern I knew very well. The difference was that this time, I wasn't willing to pretend I didn't see what was happening. I knew Tyler was returning to old habits, but part of me still hoped he could control himself long enough to pass my 1-month test. At the end of the 4th week, any illusion I still had about Tyler's ability to really change was completely destroyed. He came home on a Thursday night clearly altered, trying to act normal, but failing miserably. His eyes were strange, he was talking too fast, and there was that smell I had learned to associate with nights he used. When I confronted him directly, "Tyler, did you use today?" He tried to deny it, but when I said I was going to call his boss to confirm if he had really stayed late at work, he finally admitted it. "It was just a little bit, Sophia." I was nervous because the month is almost over and I wanted to relax. It doesn't mean I haven't changed. It means I'm human and made a mistake. It was the same emotional manipulation as always, trying to make me feel cruel for having basic expectations of sobriety. That night, I made one of the most difficult decisions of my life. While Tyler slept, I started planning my exit. I called Noah and explained the situation, asked him to help me move the next day, while Tyler was at work. I couldn't go through another cycle of empty promises and inevitable relapses. At 40 years old, I had finally understood that some people simply can't or won't change, regardless of how much love you offer them. Tyler had had countless chances over 7 years, including the most important chance of all, becoming a father. And even then, he couldn't stay clean for even a complete month. If I stayed, I would be signing my own certificate that I accept crumbs of affection and commitment for the rest of my life. On Friday morning, after Tyler left for work, thinking everything was normal between us, Noah and I emptied my apartment in 3 hours. Furniture, clothes, personal items, everything went to my parents' house while I looked for my own place to start over. I left a letter for Tyler explaining my decision, saying I loved him but that I couldn't sacrifice my sanity and my future for someone who wasn't willing to fight for himself. When I locked the door of that apartment for the last time and handed the keys to the landlord, I felt simultaneously devastated and relieved. Devastated because I was ending 7 years of my life. Relieved because I was finally making a decision based on what I needed instead of what I hoped someone else would become. But what I didn't know was that Tyler wasn't going to accept my decision as easily as I expected, and that the next few months were going to test my resolve in ways I never imagined. 2 months after the move, I was finally starting to feel like a complete person again. I had rented a small but cozy apartment on the other side of Cedar Creek, away from the memories Tyler and I had built together. I was working 2 jobs to be able to pay the bills alone, but for the first time in years I felt like I was building something that was mine, that no one could destroy with irresponsible choices. My family had finally stopped walking on eggshells around me, and I started rediscovering who Sophia was when she wasn't defined by trying to save another person. It was a strange but good feeling, like breathing fresh air after years living in a smoke-filled room. I was starting to believe that maybe I had really made the right choice this time. It was on a rainy Tuesday that Tyler appeared at the bus station where I always caught the bus to come back from my second job. He was different. Thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, but his eyes were clean in a way I hadn't seen for a long time. "Sophia, please, just give me 5 minutes to talk," he said, and there was a humility in his voice that was new. Against my better judgment, I agreed to listen. Tyler told me he had lost his job at the parts store 2 days after I left, that he had been devastated when he came home and saw the empty apartment. that he had spent weeks using heavier than ever, trying to forget that he had lost the only good thing in his life. "But Sophia," he said, holding my hands in a way that reminded me of the first days we met. "Losing you made me realize I need real help, not just empty promises." Tyler explained that an old family friend had called offering a job at a construction company in Nevada. It was hard work, well paid, in a city where he didn't know anyone and wouldn't have access to Cedar Creek's temptations. "Sophia, this could be my chance to really start over, away from everything that reminds me of drugs, away from the people who sell to me, away from the places where I always relapsed. But I'll only go if you believe I can change. If you give me one last chance to prove I can be the man you deserve." He cried when he said this, but they were different tears, not of desperation or manipulation, but of someone who had finally understood the gravity of the situation. For a moment, looking at him at that bus station, I saw the Tyler I had fallen in love with 7 years before drugs transformed him into someone I didn't recognize. The decision to give one last chance was one of the most difficult I've ever made in my life. Logically, I knew it was crazy. Tyler had already broken my trust so many times I had lost count. But emotionally, I still loved the man he could be when he was sober. And the idea that a completely new environment could be exactly what he needed to get rid of addiction made sense. After much talking and crying together, I agreed he could go to Nevada and we would try to maintain the relationship long distance while he stabilized. The condition was that he had to call me every day, tell me exactly where he was and what he was doing. And at the first sign of relapse, I would cut contact definitively. It was my last attempt to save our relationship, but this time with clear rules and defined consequences. The first 3 weeks were like a dream I didn't dare believe could be real. Tyler called me every morning before going to work and every night when he got home. He told me about work, how it was challenging but rewarding, how he was earning well, how his coworkers were nice but he kept his distance to focus on recovery. He sent photos of the construction site, of the simple apartment he had rented, even of the food he made for dinner. It was like he had finally understood that total transparency was the price of keeping my trust. I started feeling hope again, but a different hope, more cautious, more based on concrete actions than on promises. But at the end of the 3rd week, everything started falling apart again. Tyler stopped calling at agreed times, and when I managed to talk to him, there were always excuses. The phone ran out of battery, I had to work overtime and couldn't call. I was so tired I went to sleep early. The conversations became shorter, less detailed, and I started feeling that familiar anxiety growing in my chest. When I asked specifically about how he was dealing with the urge to use, the answers became vague. "Everything's fine, I haven't been thinking about it. Work keeps me busy." It was like he had gone back to the mode of telling me only what I wanted to hear, instead of sharing the reality of what he was living. The confirmation of my worst fears came in a way I never imagined. Tyler had stopped answering my calls for 3 days when I received a message from an unknown Nevada number. "Hi, you must be the Sophia that Tyler always talks about. I'm Marcus, I work with him. I found his phone on the ground after he passed out last night. I thought you should know he's been hanging out with some pretty heavy people here, using some stuff that I don't know if he'll survive much longer if he keeps it up. Sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I thought someone who cares about him should know." When I read that message, I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Tyler hadn't just relapsed, he had found an even worse group in Nevada and was using more dangerous substances than ever. When Tyler finally called me 2 days later, still under the influence of something, trying to explain that he had had some problems at work and that's why he hadn't been able to talk to me, I knew I had reached the end of the line. "Tyler," I said with a calm I didn't know I had, "I know what's really happening there, and you know that I know. So I'm going to say this only once. We're done. Definitively. Don't call me anymore. Don't try to convince me of anything. Don't come back to Cedar Creek expecting me to change my mind. I'm tired of being your anchor while you voluntarily drown." He tried to argue, make promises, say he could explain everything, but I hung up the phone and blocked his number. After 7 years, trying to save Tyler from himself, I finally understood that the only person I could and should save was myself. That night, sitting in my small but safe apartment, I cried for the last time for Tyler Mitchell. They weren't tears of anger or regret, but of relief. Relief for finally having found the strength to choose my own mental sanity above another person's unrealized potential. At 40 years old, I had learned the most important lesson of my life. You can't love someone until they heal, and trying to do so only results in two broken people instead of one. But what I didn't know was that Tyler wasn't going to accept my final decision, and that he still had one last card to play that would test my resolve in a way I never imagined possible. 3 months passed in blessed silence. 3 months without desperate calls in the middle of the night. Without broken promises, without the emotional roller coaster that had defined my life for so long. I was starting to rediscover myself as an independent woman. I had gotten a promotion at work, was taking dance classes on Saturdays, had even gone out to dinner a few times with colleagues who showed romantic interest. For the first time in 7 years, I woke up in the morning without that constant anxiety of not knowing what version of Tyler I would find when I got home. It was a peace I had forgotten existed. A lightness that made me realize how much unnecessary emotional weight I had carried for so long. I was finally starting to believe I could have a normal, healthy life without constant drama. It was on a Thursday in December, when I was leaving work, that I saw Tyler standing next to my car in the parking lot. My heart immediately raced, not with love or longing, but with pure fear of what this unexpected apparition could mean. He was different once again, cleaner than the last time I had seen him in person, dressed in new clothes, but there was something in his eyes that immediately put me on alert. "Sophia, please, don't run away," he said when he saw me hesitate. "I know you don't want to see me, but I need to tell you what happened in Nevada. I need you to know that this time it's really different." Against all my self-preservation instincts, I agreed to listen, not because I wanted to, but because part of me needed definitive closure. Tyler told me a story that sounded almost too good to be true. After our last conversation, he had hit rock bottom in a way that almost killed him. He had woken up in a hospital in Las Vegas after an overdose that doctors said should have been fatal. "Sophia, I saw death up close and realized I had two choices. Die alone, in a strange city like any addict, or really fight for the life I wanted to have with you." He said he had checked himself into a rehabilitation clinic for 2 months, that he was attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings, that he had gotten a stable job at a moving company and was saving money to be able to return to Cedar Creek as a real man. The tears in his eyes seemed sincere. The conviction in his voice was different from all the other times, but I had been fooled so many times that my heart was armored against hope. "Tyler," I said, trying to keep my voice firm, despite the whirlwind of emotions I was feeling. "I've heard this story before, maybe with different details, but the essence is always the same. You hit rock bottom, have a revelation, promise you've changed, and after a few weeks or months you go back to old habits. I can't go through this anymore. I literally don't have any more emotional energy to invest in promises." But Tyler had an answer for my resistance. He pulled out a wallet full of Narcotics Anonymous chips, showed the certificate of completion from the rehabilitation program, even showed bank statements proving he was employed and saving money. "Sophia, I know words don't mean anything coming from me, but look at the evidence. I'm not asking you to take me back today. I'm asking for a chance to prove over time that I really changed." Tyler's proposal was both tempting and terrifying. He wanted to return to Cedar Creek, get a job, live alone, and gradually rebuild my trust through consistent actions over months or even years. "I don't want you to make any decision now," he said. "I want you to observe me from afar, see if my actions match my words this time. If in 6 months I can prove I really changed, maybe you'll consider giving me one last chance. If I fail, you'll never have to see me in front of you again." It was a different approach from all the other times, less desperate, more strategic, more mature. For the first time, Tyler was recognizing that the responsibility to prove his change was his. Not my responsibility to believe blindly in him. But while Tyler talked about new beginnings and second chances, I was dealing with a reality he didn't know. Other men had started showing interest in me in recent months. David, a divorced 38-year-old coworker, had invited me to dinner 3 times and had always been a perfect gentleman. Michael, a childhood friend who had returned to Cedar Creek after his divorce, had made it clear he was interested in exploring a romantic relationship with me. For the first time in years, I had options: stable, mature men without addictions who treated me with respect and genuine admiration. Tyler's proposal potentially meant giving up these new possibilities to bet once again on a horse that had already thrown me off countless times. The pressure of the decision was different this time because I was no longer the woman desperate for love who had met Tyler 7 years before. I was a 40-year-old woman who had learned to value peace of mind above passion, stability above emotional intensity. I knew that choosing to give Tyler a chance meant risking everything I had built in the last months of independence and personal growth. But I also knew that if I didn't give this last chance and Tyler had really changed, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what if. It was the kind of dilemma that doesn't have a right or wrong answer, only consequences. You have to live with your choices. And while I pondered all these variables, time was running out. Other suitors were waiting for an answer, and my family was watching my every move, hoping I would finally choose my own happiness above any romantic drama. The only thing I knew for certain was that this time, whatever decision I made, it would be based on what was best for Sophia, not on what Tyler needed or deserved. At 40 years old, I had finally learned that my life couldn't be defined by the need to save other people, but by the courage to build my own happiness. But what I still didn't know was that the universe was preparing a final test that would determine not just the future of my relationship with Tyler, but the future of my entire love life. Because sometimes, when you think you finally understand all the rules of the game, life completely changes the rules, and you need to discover who you really are when everything you thought you knew becomes irrelevant. And here we are at the end of this journey that lasted almost 2 decades of my life. A woman who confused love with salvation, who believed her capacity to endure suffering was a virtue, but who finally learned that setting boundaries isn't cruelty and that choosing your own peace of mind isn't selfishness. Today, at 40 years old, I understand that I wasted 19 years, not because I chose the wrong men, but because I didn't know who I was when I wasn't trying to fix another person. And only when I learned to be okay with myself was I able to recognize the kind of love I really deserve. I want to know from you guys, which part of this story touched you most? Have you been through something similar? Comment below telling your experiences and what kind of content you want to see on this channel. If you want more about rebuilding self-esteem, how to recognize red flags, or stories from other women in similar situations. If this story made you reflect on your own relationships, share this video with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because my mission is to create a community where we can talk openly about relationships and personal growth. Because at the end of the day, we all deserve relationships that elevate us. Partners who see our love as a gift, and mainly, to know that our happiness doesn't depend on being able to change another person, but on choosing people who arrive ready to love in a healthy way.